Okay, how we doing? My name is Rodney, and I pastor Stonegate Church, and I have 10 minutes, so pray for me. Pray for me. Here we go. So in 2002, I was hired to do student ministry, and when I got there, the pastor looked at me and said, Rodney, you need to get your life ready because here in a few years, we are going to plant you. I'm like, what does that even mean? I don't know what are we planting? Is it a plant? I don't know what that is. But looking back, that conversation ended up being one of the defining moments of my life. When I look back and describe that moment, I oftentimes think about the Chronicles of Narnia, the moment when the kiddos found the wardrobe. And they went through the wardrobe and found this whole other world. That was my moment of finding this whole new world called church planting. You know, it's funny for me to look back and think about how I didn't even know what the idea of church planting was. I'd never heard about that phrase before. All of that was unfamiliar to me. I'd never, at that point in my life, stopped to think and recognize that I guess every church was started at some point. That just never had dawned on me. I'd never thought about that every church had a start. Either a church sent a person out to go start that new work, or a guy was just crazy enough to go try it on his own. But every church had that type of a start. Church planting. And I want to take just a couple of minutes to encourage you toward that. From 2002, when I first heard about church planting, I've learned a couple of things about church planting. And here's two things that I learned. One is I learned that church planting is biblical. We love the Great Commission, right? All of us love the Great Commission. The Great Commission is in Matthew 28, where we hear these words, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I will be with you always to the end of the age." Now, when I think about the Great Commission, I think there's two primary ways to apply it. One, we might think of it as personal application. Right? It is for you and for me as people. We are to be people, the people of Jesus, who are going and making disciples who make disciples. As a pastor, as a person who loves Jesus, this is like the call of our life, isn't it? To be disciple makers. This is on a personal level what God has called us to do, to share Jesus with people, then to invest our life into them, to see them grow up into Jesus. It's just that personal work of making disciples who make disciples. So yes, there's that personal application, and there is a corporate church-wide application. It can also be applied across a church. And as a church, just like personally, you're to reproduce yourself by making disciples, a church is meant to reproduce themselves by raising up a church planter, investing and equipping into that church planter, and then sending that church planter to reproduce that church. We, as a church, are called to do that type of work. If you want to see how the Great Commission was actually carried out, post the Gospels, you just turn to the book of Acts and read the book of Acts, and it's showing us this is how, on a practical level, the Great Commission plays itself out. Acts is a church planting letter. That's what it is. It's just chronicling the planting of churches. First, you have the church that's planted in Jerusalem. That's the first 7 chapters of Acts. And then you have the church that is planted in Antioch. This is one of the defining moments in the history of church planting. A group of Christians leave Jerusalem, and they find themselves in Antioch, and they plant that church in Antioch. And then if you keep reading in Acts 13, that church in Antioch, as the Jerusalem church is becoming more and more just increasingly inward, this church in Antioch becomes the first great sending church. All of our churches on some level are connected to this first sending church there in Antioch. So if you keep reading in Acts 13 and 14, you know what happens there. Antioch sends out Paul and Barnabas. They send out a couple of their best people. And you know kind of Paul's sort of strategy. He'd go to one of the large cities in an area. He would preach the gospel. Some people would meet Jesus, and Jesus would save them. Then he would form those people into a church. He would raise up some local church leaders in there. Then he would leave to do it all over again. And just over and over, you see this churches planting churches that plant churches. This is how these early churches fulfilled the Great Commission. They did that by planting churches. This is why basically every New Testament letter is written to help, encourage, serve church planters and church plants. All of those New Testament letters are doing that work. So I just want you to see that it's biblical. When you are planting churches as a church, as a pastor, you are walking in the footsteps of the New Testament. It is biblical. But I learned another thing about church planting. Not only is it biblical, but church planting is best. It is best. So I found back in 2002, I found the wardrobe, right? I walked into Narnia, this new world of church planting. Then 7 years later, that church sent me out with a group of about 20 adults to plant what would become Stonegate Church there in Midlothian. And we had like about a 6 month sort of lead up to planting Stonegate. And one of the things that the Lord confronted me with was a question during that little lead up. And here was the question. Rodney, will you do ministry in a way that ends with you or in a way that outlives you? That was the question. Are you going to do ministry in a way that ends with you or in a way that outlives you? And when confronted with that question, I don't know what your heart does when you're confronted with that question, but my heart just leapt toward, gosh, I want to do ministry in a way where it outlives me, where it's going beyond my time and beyond my days. I so want that. And friend, if you want that, the best way to achieve that is by prioritizing, giving time, attention, and priority to church planting. That is the best way to have your ministry outlive you. You know, it doesn't matter how great your church is right now. If you're looking at your church right now and just like, it is awesome. Doesn't matter how great it is right now. There is going to be a day where your church withers and probably dies. It's a humbling thing to think as a pastor, isn't it? Right now, I love what I get to see at Stonegate. I get to see a church that's spiritually vibrant, loving Jesus, loving our city. I love what I see, but there is going to be a day, if I look into the future, where Stonegate has withered and maybe even has died. If you just do like in your own just anecdotal sort of experience, how many churches do you know that are 150 years old, 200 years old, that are as spiritually vibrant as they once were? You might know a few, but you probably know a lot more that aren't, right? That have withered and died over time. But what if in 150 years from now, you have planted 5 churches? Then those 5 churches plant 5 churches. Then those 25 churches plant 5 churches. Then those 25 churches plant another 5 churches, and now you got 125. And those 125 plant 5 churches, and now you got 625. And what if those guys plant 5 churches, and in 150 years you look up and there's 3,000 churches that could all trace their roots back to your church? I bet you a lot of those churches are going to be spiritually vibrant, alive. People are going to be meeting Jesus there, conforming people into the image of Jesus there, making disciples there. So where does church planting begin? I think it first begins with a conviction that this is true. It's biblical and it's best. And then it starts with a willingness to pay the cost. Conviction and then the cost. Am I willing to pay the price to see a church planted? And if those 2 things are in place, right, conviction and a willingness to pay the cost, then all we have to do is find a guy. It's one of the things I pray for as much as anything. God, will you give us our next church planter? God, will you show me who that is? And then when you find that guy, you develop that guy. Then you partner with some other churches and you see that guy planted. And then if you keep doing that, you're going to be able to look up in 150 years from now when you're gone. But your ministry is still thriving because you're going to get to see what those 3,000 churches look like. Amen? I want to pray for you. Father, would you stir up in our hearts the desire to see ministry outlive us? God, would you do that? God, would you make us willing to pay the price to see churches planted? And it's in your good name that we ask it. Amen.